him present.
All righty. All right, I'm assuming my screen is being shared.
Yes, it is. We can see. It looks great.
Okay, so anyway, thanks for the introduction. I'm excited to be involved in this again this year. I think it's a great program. And so today, sort of informally, I want to basically just introduce the 3MT for what it is. I think many people might have heard about it, but not know some of the specifics about, what it entails. And then I want to give you some pointers about what makes a really good 3MT, and I'll finish off with some tips on how you can get started to prepare your own as well. And so just to start then, so what is the 3-minute thesis? So fundamentally, it's a celebration or really an institutional showcase of the research that's being carried out by graduate students. And it's written PhD students here, but these days many institutions are also opening it up to thesis-based masters research as well. And so the 3MT challenges the student, you guys, to effectively explain your research to a non-specialist audience. So what do I mean by effectively? What essentially effectively means in a compelling way that not only does it explain to your audience or allow your audience to understand what you're doing and why it's important, but also it makes them, hopefully it gets them excited about your research so that they want to know more about it. And the real kicker to the 3MT is, based on its name, you have 3 minutes to do this, which seems like a very short amount of time, but when you're actually talking, 3 minutes is a fairly long time. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Other things about this that you may not be familiar with is that you have a single static slide in contrast to the typical slide deck that we use to present our research, and there's no props. Essentially, it's you, a single slide, in the audience. And so just as a way of a little bit of history, so this competition arose in a place in Australia called Queensland, and they're subject to fairly, or now and again, they get some severe drought. So many people in Queensland, Australia, they have these 3-minute egg timers in their showers. And so the idea is that you would shower, and when the sand runs out, you have to turn off the water to conserve the water during these droughts. And I guess it was the dean of the University of Queensland graduate school was in the shower one day, probably getting ready to attend a 2-hour-long dissertation defense, when they put 2 and 2 together and came up with this 3MT competition. And the first one was held at the University of Queensland in 2008. Augusta University had their first competition in 2017, and the benefits of this competition, mostly for the students, but of course for the mentors and the institution as well, was recognized so widely that it's now held at over 900 universities in 85 countries across the globe. And even in our neighborhood, so, Augusta University has their competition, so does UGA, Emory, Georgia Tech. And so we, and there's regional competitions for the winners can compete in as well. All right, so some of the benefits that might, hopefully encourage you to participate in this year's competition. The first one shown here on the left is basically it's a great opportunity to market yourself. And so if you were to get to the final competition, then you'll get an edited version of a video with a stable web link that you can attach to your CV or to your web page or to a job application, for example, that really showcases you dressed well, presenting a really rehearsed and polished presentation. And so this can be very useful. And I know, this lady here, Sarah Sharman, her presentation actually did get her current career position. So another important attribute or benefit to participating in the 3MT competition is that you develop an important communication skill set. And to better understand what I mean by that is most of us in academia are used to this kind of presentation where you have a podium and a slide deck there that can organize your thoughts and round off your story. And more importantly, you have an audience of people that came to your seminar. They're typically also in your field, so they understand the language that you're presenting in, and more importantly, that they're interested enough to take time out of their day to come and listen to what you have to say. Now, if you contrast that with something like this audience, and so this is a slice of the general public. And these people are here maybe for a lot of things. You might envision this as you were invited to do a presentation or discuss some of your research to get this group excited at a fundraiser. It might be an American Heart Association, or it might be, an American Cancer Society meeting or something like this, where you don't have a slide deck. This audience is not educated to the same level you are, and you have to try and talk to this audience to, for example, get this person really interested, wake this guy up. And so it's a completely different way of presenting than we're actually trained to do in academia typically. So how about this audience? So this could be a recruitment panel, and you're there visiting to do a job presentation. And so imagine yourself in this situation where they're just asking you about your research, and what are you going to say that they would find interesting about your research? And then if you end up being somewhat an authority or an expert in your field, you may have the opportunity to interact with a news anchor where this is the Means Report, a local news station. And this is actually an AU faculty that was invited, and actually invited from different departments fairly regularly on the Means Report, where they ask you questions about your research, and then you need to describe it in a way to a general audience in a way that helps them understand it and understands how your research affects them. And so here's some examples of presenting your research to a non-trained or non-specialist audience without the benefit of a podium and a slide deck. And so I think that's a really important one. Another important benefit that isn't intuitively obvious for most people that look at the 3-minute thesis competition, and that is that it can give you a different perspective or a new understanding of the impact of the research that you're doing. And so just to give you an example of that, if you look at the different sort of venues or forums for communicating research that you're doing, I think almost all of us are familiar with writing a manuscript, with presenting poster presentations at meetings, doing a seminar with a slide deck like I showed you, writing grant proposals or fellowship proposals, for example, and the 3-minute thesis. And if you look at all of these different forums, they really have the same parts. And why shouldn't they have the same parts? Because you're doing something in your research as part of your thesis work. Why should the key points, the significance of it, what you did, and the conclusions change depending on the venue? It's the same thing. And if we just look at the ones that are definitely in common, this is basically how you tell a story that can communicate your research to any audience. The difference between writing a manuscript, for example, and a 3-minute thesis, it's not the specific topics and your story, it's really the audience. So the story that's common for all of these is you start out by explaining why the research that you're doing is important, and then you basically talk about what you did, and then or how you did it, and then you talk about what you observed, and then you finish up with some conclusions or implications of your research. And that's a common thing that can go under the title of your story. And the 3-minute thesis is no different than a manuscript. The difference is that if you're writing a manuscript or doing a departmental seminar or something like that, you're talking to people that are in your field and they speak your language. Compared to a 3-minute thesis, your audience in this case They don't speak your language necessarily, but the points are the same. The reason that or students and faculty alike are often challenged to put a 3-minute thesis together because the central elements of your research have to be crystal clear when you're talking about a non-special audience. So let me get into that a little bit more. And so the reason that it's challenging is because as scientists doing research, we spend our time in the weeds, and we often have a hard time sort of visualizing the big picture, the 10,000-foot view of your research, because we're sort of, our day-to-day life is calculations and doing measurements and trying to get techniques to work and whatnot. So they say we can't see the forest because of the trees, and our day-to-day life is filled with these very detailed things that people that aren't specialists, the public or a lay audience, they have absolutely no idea of anything that you see down here in the weeds. So the challenge is to find out what it is that you're doing in your lab that would interest or affect the lay audience in order to be able to explain it to them. And so if we just sort of move up this pyramid in terms of the relative knowledge level, so you and maybe people that are in your research group that are doing similar things, you may be in the weeds together, but even people that are in the same field but doing something slightly different, such as people that would be reviewing a manuscript that you submit or reviewing a grant proposal. These people are not doing exactly what you're doing in the lab, so they're a little bit higher up. They're not as knowledgeable about it as you are, and so you have to come outside of your comfort zone sometimes just to explain to even people that are well educated in your field what it is that you're doing and what you found. As we go up, colleagues that are studying something different, maybe investors in your research, news anchors, as we talked about, politicians even. This is very important. They direct funding to your research, and then ultimately this lay audience. And so why is it important that we actually try to communicate our research in this non-specialist format? And the answer to that is because actually down here in the weeds, we're a minority. The vast majority of people that benefit from the research that you do, and by way of either donations or taxes, they actually fund the research that you do. So it's very important that we actually take some effort to explain to them, where their research dollars are going and how it's important to them. All right, so the rest of my presentation is really going to look at what are the elements that make a 3-minute thesis presentation effective, and then how do you get started in presenting your own or putting your own together. And so the first place to look is actually the judging criteria. And so if you were to go to the 3-minute thesis website at the University of Queensland, they have very detailed instructions for judges on what they have to look at to evaluate various presentations. And there's really two separate components. The first one is comprehension, and I just refer to it as content. And so this is basically your story. And so this is, in my view, the most important component of it. So what is your story? What are you talking about? The second thing that you're judged on is your communication. And so this is, your stage presence, your charisma. How do so these are two separate issues. And so if we say, how do you start on your presentation, or what's the format for putting a 3-minute thesis presentation together? Really, it all starts with the content. Trying to figure out what your story is. Historically, I've been involved in this for several years now, and there's a lot of students will come to, they'll quickly put their content together, and they'll spend a lot of time, because it's actually fun setting up or getting your presentation skills and standing up in front of an audience and talking about this. But if the content is bad, then overall your presentation is not, your actual 3-minute thesis is not going to be good. So really, you need to spend an awful lot of time making sure that your story is accurate and compelling. And then when you've got that together, then you can kind of take the key elements of your presentation or of your story, and then you can reformat it so that it's more conversational. So rather that your content can be bullet point, here's the main points that I'm going to talk about. And then you need to sort of rewrite that in a way that you're telling the story in a conversation or presentation format. And then once you've got that, then you actually have to practice it. And these are things like what do you do with your hands? Where do you look at where you're looking at in terms of the audience? Are you smiling? These kinds of little things. And really, this presentation part is something that develops right at the very end when you're practicing it in front of different audiences. And so this last part here, practice, 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 practice. If you start with the content, you got great content, and you just start presenting that to colleagues, to friends, to family, sooner or later, your style and presentation, stage presence, they're going to be honed by practicing in front of different audiences. So getting the content is the most important thing, and then finally practicing is the main is the next thing that's going to make you a winner. All right, so to get you started, this here page is actually part of the handout. I believe it's the first page of the handout. And so on this handout, there's these are hot linked. This is actually just an image from the handout, but these are all hot linked. And these are a bunch of presentations. This last one here, actually, I just added. It's a COVID one, so it was done remotely. And these were chosen because they have very kind of diverse projects that they're talking about, diverse presentation styles. And if you look at all of these different ones, then you'll find that there's some common elements. And that's the main thing that I want to get across here. I think that before you put pen to paper, figuratively, to start your own 3-minute thesis, you want to look at as many videos as you can to get a feel for what aspects of your research that you want to bring to the surface, and how that can be done effectively. So just go to YouTube and type in 3MT. That's basically what this link does. We've had 5 competitions so far. This is actually outdated. We've had about 5 competitions now at AU. Each one of those is in the graduate school 3MT website, so you can see all of the runners up and winners presentations. So definitely have a look at these and you get a feel for it. There's also, when you have your content again, then there's also some tools here that are going to help you with the communication aspect of it. These are, hand chosen after watching many videos that give you some ideas. One that's specific for 3MT, these 2 here, and then there's some more generic ones. This one about how to use your hands is fantastic. This communication tips here, this is going to help you do non-3MT, just general presentation tips. So these videos here should help you immensely. So let's say, as I mentioned before, that the content is the most important things. So if you watch lots and lots of videos, you should be able to notice that there's several components that they all have in common. Okay, and if you miss one of these components when you're putting your own presentation together, the judges and the audience are going to have questions. They're going to feel like there's something missing. So these are the bare essential elements of your 3-minute thesis that you need to address within that 3 minutes. Okay, so this here, these questions, I'm going to go through each one of these in detail. This makes up your story and the foundation for your 3-minute thesis. The presentation or communication style and the slide really should come after your content is fully put together. Don't try to put your slide together first or in the middle while you're doing it. When your presentation is done, including put in a presentation format, then you can really start thinking about your slide. Okay. All right, so let's look at these components. And again, you don't have to be writing notes about what these components are, because part of that handout that I put in the chat, I think this is like the second page, is this what we called an entry form previously, but basically it's fillable PDF. So you can look at each one of these sections. When you're thinking about your own research, you can type in some bullet point forms that address each one of these issues, and that's how you start getting your 3-minute thesis content together. Okay. All right, so let's look at the first component then, the first section of your content, and that is to ask the question. So why are you asking the question? And more importantly, actually, what can you say, or why should the audience care about the research that you're doing? And so there's two components of this. The first is identifying actually what your specific project is that you're going to talk about. And then the second is what are you going to tell the audience to make them care about it? And so, the first one is, often it can be challenging because when we do research, particularly at the PhD level, we have more than one project. So you need to find out which project you're going to present. So if we're doing multiple projects, but they're related, it's often too much. It's overload of information to present all projects. So you need to find a single project that you want to focus on. The next thing to do is to try and sort out the signal from the noise, as it were, considering that pyramid where we're down in the weeds and we're distracted by all of these measurements and techniques and methods and calculations and whatnot. Then you need to sort of put that aside and try and figure out what the main goal of the research is. And it sounds very simple, but it's often not. Because you need to say, for example, in my laboratory, I do colorectal cancer research, but then so does maybe 1,000 other laboratories on the planet. So why is my research different? And so you really need to sort of reflect upon your own research and what the main objectives are. And so one way that I found is very helpful to do this is if you think about the research that you're doing, and then you think about, okay, what if your project is successful? Your hypothesis is proven correct. And then what are you going to do with that information? Presumably you're in a larger laboratory or a group. And so what if the people that follow you and continue your research, what if they're successful? So in the long run, who's going to benefit from that research? What are the outcomes going to be that are going to sort of change the world, as it were? Okay, so these are things that you really need to think about, not necessarily what if your experiment, when it's completed, what is that going to mean to the world? It's more the big picture. So the whole thesis is successful. People follow you up, your laboratory or your research group, what have you, they're successful, then who's going to benefit from that? The second thing that can really help you try and identify who the benefactors will be and how that project is going to impact to the bigger picture is what's the current state of affairs, like what's wrong with the current situation that when your research, if it's successful, is gonna fix. Does that make sense? And so these are two questions that you really need to sort of think about in order to identify the main objective of your work with this idea that you're trying to understand the main goal from this, the general public perspective. So what is the outcomes of your research? How are they going to affect the population at large? All right. That's harder than you would think. The second part is if you understand, you've got this project, you understand how this is going to affect the world at large, then you have to come up with something that's going to make that audience. So remember that picture I had of this general slice of the public audience? They all have different backgrounds. Many are educated in different fields, but so what do you tell them to try and get all of them in the audience interested in the research that you do, or to appreciate the research that you're doing is important? And so this is often called, also known as the hook. You have to say something that wakes the people up in that audience and makes them want to listen to what you have to say. And so, why is your research important to the general public? And so there's different ways that you can go about doing this. I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about, how to the presentation aspects of it. I'd rather focus on, the specifics of the content. But here's some ideas. So the current state of affairs that your research may affect. Oftentimes, especially for biomedical related research, animals or children, people are being harmed or suffering in some way. And so the audience are people, they have pets or children, what have you. And then so you can evoke compassion. So they're interested in listening to what you have to say because the outcomes of your research is going to prevent this. Okay, and so this is one way of doing this. Another one is to directly affect the audience themselves. So either somebody in the audience, one of their children or their mother, for example, is susceptible to something that your research is going to change that. And then lastly, if it's not biomedical or something, then there's other societal costs at large, whether it may be an education of our children thing, it could be taxes, pollution, what have you. But so you have to think about, again, big picture. Your research is successful, somebody follows it, they're successful. What is that big impact that it's going to have on some kind of current situation? And all of our research, if it's funded, has this reason for doing it. Typically, we don't expend resources on doing research just because. We always typically have a reason, and that reason is to change something for the better. So you need to identify what that is in your research, come out with something that you can say to the audience to make them kind of hooked or sit up in their seats ready to listen to what you have to say. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on style, but there are ways of going about, attracting the attention of your audience or hooking your audience as well. And there's no set format on how to do this. You can ask the audience a question to have them start thinking about your research or the field. You can ask the audience to participate in some way. Or imagining some character that's maybe suffering in some way or tell a story, however you want to do it. But this gives you an example of identifying from your research the big picture impact of it, and then translating it or transforming it into this more presentation style that's going to captivate your audience and make them want to listen to what you're going to say next. So that's just the first component. What is your research about, and what is the bigger picture impact of it? The second thing is, as I mentioned, myself, so I study colorectal cancer, but so does 1,000 other laboratories. Some people are looking at new immunotherapies. Some people are just trying to measure who gets colon cancer. For me, I measure one of my projects because I have multiple. One of them is developing new drugs that can prevent colorectal cancer. And so you need to ask your question, whatever you're studying in your lab, in your research, I can guarantee you that there's dozens of other research groups that are also studying something very, very similar. So you have to try and figure out what is it about your specific research that's unique. So, that's a very important thing. It's very easy to say, well, I'm going to cure cancer, but then so many other people are. So what is your specific hypothesis? And so this is often very challenging to do as well. So once you know the big picture, then you have to say, okay, what's your hypothesis? The problem with identifying your hypothesis is that, your audience typically, they don't know what you do. So they're sort of up on that pyramid, whereas hypotheses are typically a little bit closer down into the weeds. And so for that reason, you need to educate, you need to kind of bring your hypothesis up a little bit, but by the same token, you need to bring your audience down a little bit into that pyramid. So you need to educate them on some of your field-specific phenomenon or terminology in order for them to understand exactly what you did and what you found. Okay, and so just to sort of bring that into the bigger picture, when you're talking about your 3MT as a whole, as I said, so the first part of that is, how does your work affect the audience? So, and the big picture story, and then you need to educate them to some degree so that they can understand your hypothesis. And so you'll find even after your hypothesis and you've educated them a little bit, you have to bring them down a little bit more by educating them some more so you can understand how you're testing it. Oftentimes the research that we're doing can be somewhat complicated experiments, and so again we need to educate them again so that they can understand the basis for how your experiment works, basically. Okay, so this is about as far down into the weeds as you want to bring them, but there's no escaping, this educating the audience, the lay audience, so that they can really truly understand your research. And so there's a few rules that we've come up with that can help you with that as well. The first rule is throw out all of the technical jargon and terminology that you use regularly with your colleagues and peers, and just throw that out of the window and find other terms, for phenomenon that you have an expression for. Come up with something that's similar to that is familiar to the educated but non-specialist audience. Okay, so metaphors that allow the audience to really understand what you're trying to explain, but based on their own experiences, and not something that you have to be in a laboratory or in a research group to understand. The second thing is, what they say is don't dumb down your research. And so sometimes students, again, will have 3 different projects in their lab as part of their research, and they'll choose the one that's the easiest to explain. And really, that goes almost completely opposite to what the 3-minute thesis is about. The 3-minute thesis is embracing the more complicated, the exercise of trying to explain something that's complicated to a non-specialist audience. So don't take the short path. Really choose the project that you're mostly focused on and explain that one. Okay, and so a lot of times, again, there'll be something this is way too complicated for most people to explain, and I would say there's absolutely nothing that you're doing in your research that's too complicated to explain to somebody that is not educated in your field. Everything can be explained. And if you don't believe so, then again, look at several 3-minute theses, even TED Talks, and you'll find out that the most complicated projects you can imagine are explainable if you use these rules. The last one is, and this is very important, not only for your 3-minute thesis, but also if you're putting a grant together or a manuscript together, is that you're not trying to make the audience experts in your field. You don't want to teach them things that are only peripherally related. You need to focus specifically, like if you're going to write the introduction of a manuscript, you only focus on those phenomena or those ideas that are absolutely essential for the audience to be able to understand what you did, what you found, and what it means. Okay, so be very, very selective about the things that you're going to educate your audience on. Does that make sense? So 3 fairly simple rules. Get rid of the field-specific terminology. Try to use metaphors that can really bring your research up to the audience's level for the most part. Don't shy away from things that are too complicated. And then lastly, only teach things to your audience. Only, make them think the minimum amount that's necessary for them to understand what you're going to be talking about. All right, so the third thing that you need to discuss, of course, is how are you going to, in your research, what is it that you're doing in your research? So this is the methods section of a manuscript or what have you. And so, you want to use this component of your 3MT to give your audience a taste of your life. So when you come into your lab or office and you're going to do some research, what are you doing? And so give your audience a description that allows them to really understand what it is that you do and how you're going about doing your research. And this can be complicated because typically research involves an awful lot of different kinds of experiments. So what you need to do is, based upon your hypothesis, which is the previous section of this one, you need to identify some experiments, and sometimes you can be pulling several different measurements together, but you need to identify those ones that when the results come in, it's very clear that they're either going to support or refute the hypothesis. Okay. Again, you need to have your presentation flow and never get too far from that big picture and then your hypothesis. So the experiments, again, you need to educate your audience to some degree on so they can understand the experiments, but you can't take just all the experiments. You have to choose the specific ones that when the outcomes are going to directly address your hypothesis. If you can as well, choose those experiments that are actually cool, that, you know, people that aren't in your field might think, wow, that's, you know, they may say out loud, that's actually really cool that you can do that, or that, you know, the results that you get, wow, that's really interesting. And so, you know, maybe for your research, all the experiments you're doing are important, but you know yourself that some of them are just pretty cool. And those are the ones that you want to focus on as a way of keeping your audience engaged with your presentation. Okay, so the next part is your results. And so if you've educated them enough that they understand your experiments and you've described your experiments, the key ones, well enough, then they should understand the kind of measurements or results you'll get from those, you know, those. And I can't tell you, this is how you do it. Everybody's going to do this in a different way. What I can tell you is that you can't have a single experiment with a single result and then go and move on to the conclusions. You remember that you're telling a story and you want to include your audience so they're there with you, exploring your you know, whatever it is that you're doing in your research. So you can, it's best and most effective if you're sort of telling a story. So our hypothesis is this. So we wanted to measure this in this way, and this is what we found. And then we said, well, that gave us a cool idea. So we decided to measure this, and we found this. And then so taking those two experiments together, two results together, you can, you know, it just makes a more effective story than just a simple single hypothesis, single experiment, and we move on to the conclusions. Okay. And again, this will become pretty clear when you start watching 3-minute thesis videos online. You'll see that it's very typical to have multiple, and the actual results and experiments are part of a dialogue. All right, so the last part of your 3MT is sort of bringing it all together. And again, as I mentioned, you start out, you know, with the big picture, you're talking to your audience at their level, then you bring them down a little bit into your hypothesis, experiments, results. So now you put all your results together and make some kind of a conclusion. And, you know, the conclusion, again, it has to be focused on the hypothesis, and it has to be focused also on the big picture. And how do you do that? So you go right back to where you started again by saying, so how is the results or conclusions from your research going to affect this big picture or change the world? And I want to put this together in this, which I think is my final slide, or second from final slide. That is this pyramid again. So keep in mind that you in your research, you speak a different language, you know all kinds of stuff that your audience doesn't know. And so you start out by talking way up here. So these are positionally important. Number one, how does your work affect the audience, the big picture? That's talking in the up at the top above the trees in the forest where the audience is. So you talk about it and you set up why your research is important, the big picture part of it. As I mentioned, you need to educate your audience in order for them to understand your hypothesis, because really your hypothesis is somewhat down in the weeds a little bit. So this education is important. And when you talk about your hypothesis, it has to directly be related to this big picture. You can't sort of say, here's the big picture and how my research is going to, you know, affect, and then educate them and be down here. That the big picture is what the audience understands. And so your hypothesis has to be, you educate them a little bit, but it has to be together. The same thing, you know, you have to educate them a little bit about your techniques and your measurements and what those measurements mean. But again, it has to be that anchor to your audience's perspective is based on this big picture hypothesis experiments. And then your results are there as well. So there's number 5, the final one, when you've got your results and you're trying to draw the conclusions, you're not going further down, you're actually going right back up into the big picture again and saying, so now that we've done all these, we've got all these really cool results, so what does that mean? And to the big picture, how are you going to change this current situation that's unacceptable? Okay, so how is the conclusions from your results, how is that going to change the world? So hopefully this is kind of helpful about to illustrate why you start out talking at the audience's level, you bring them down a little bit, you never drag them down into the weeds to become an expert like you are. You bring them down a little bit, but you definitely never let go of their perspective, and you end up right back in their backyard again. Okay, that's a 3-minute thesis in a nutshell. All right, so again, I told you that you don't need to write lots of notes. Each one of those text-based slides, of course, you can watch the video, but they're also summarized. I filled in this entry form with the main questions that will help you put together. So if you're looking at the blank one and you print this one out and have a look at it, try and answer these questions about your own research in the blank form, and then that'll give you hopefully the content of your 3-minute thesis. When you get that one, then you can just copy all the text out of that, paste it to a Word document, and then start transforming it into more of a conversational presentation format. So that's the content. This is literally my final slide. So I have a few final tips about how you might want to, get started on this one on your own presentation. And the first thing is to try not to involve your mentor or lab mates, at least not at the beginning. And the reason for that is because your mentor and your lab mates or your peers, in your research group or doing related research, they have the same sort of biases, or they speak your language, and so they can actually influence your content in a bad way. So historically we've had students that have worked with their mentor right from the very beginning, and then they show up at the end, and their presentation is great, but the audience is lost because the mentor and the student made these assumptions about what people know that only people in the field assume. So really what I would try to do is really reflect on your own research based on this big picture, non-specialist, public or lay perspective. Try to do that by yourself. Identify those. You can certainly talk to them, but really try and get your content by yourself. And then you can go back and maybe present it to your mentor or your peers. But it tends to impede the effectiveness of your presentation if you go right to your peers and your mentor. It's better to do it yourself. So the second thing, again, is your content. In terms of getting your content, going back to this one again, try to discuss it with family members, or if you've got colleagues or peers that are they're not doing research like you are, they're doing something else. Talk to them about your research, and see if you've identified the impact of your research. Pass it by these people to see if it makes sense to them, and then you can sort of pivot and change, and that you'll know when you found the real content that you want to present. When you've got that one, then you can kind of go back to your peers and see how they think about it. But really try to avoid them in the beginning and go to people that are not in your field. All right, so once you've got your content, you put it into Word, then you have to rewrite the whole thing. Of course, your ideas are there. The order of your story is there if you fill out that form, but it's like you're reading something. It's very obvious when you're reading something, even if you've got it completely memorized. If you're saying it, but it's something you wrote, it just sounds awful. You have to write it in a way as if you're having a conversation with somebody about your research, rather than you're reading it from a manuscript that you wrote. So this is something that also takes some time, not quite as much time and effort as your research and trying to find out what your story is, but then actually writing your story, it takes some time. Again, you want to talk to people that are not in your field to see how does this metaphor grab you? Do you understand that or whatever? And you get the feedback on your story. Okay, so once you have your presentation that is now in conversational, this is actually when you get these two things done, students tend to get excited because you've got your story and you want to say it to as many people. You want to see how people react to it. That's when you have a lot of fun. And so once you get your story and it's in this conversational presentation format, unlike most presentations you might do for the 3-minute thesis, you can't really ad lib. You don't have time. You got 3 minutes, and if you're a couple of seconds over that 3-minute mark, you're disqualified. And so you really have to memorize word for word that smooth, polished presentation that you've already, talked to people about, and memorize that thing. And once you've got it memorized, again, you get really comfortable, and it's just a joy to present it at that point. And that's when you really focus on things about, how do you stand? Do you move back and forth? Are you smiling? Who are you looking at? These kinds of things. So really get your content, make sure it's the best content, involve non-specialist people while you're converting that into a conversational presentation style, memorize the thing. And I've seen some fantastic presentations that would have won the final competition and they forgot their line. And, heroic recoveries when they managed that, like maybe 4 seconds of silence and then they recovered from it. But it's only because they just didn't fully memorize it. Memorizing it really comes with practice. You practice it backwards and forwards, so you know every line. And I'm telling you, once you get this smooth content, you practice it, it's really just a lot of fun. And in the end, you'll really understand your project better than you ever have before. And that's all I have to say. So I thank you for your attention. And I will address any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Darren. That was great. A lot of really, really good information there. We have a lot of students on here and various people. If you guys have questions, go ahead and ask. You can just unmute yourself. Something was happening in the chat there, so I don't know if the chat is working. But if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Another thing, if you can't find the handout, that's all I'm seeing in the chat is, send an email to 3mt@augusta.edu and Dr. Cameron will send it back to you.
Or yeah, I can, I wrote down all the names of the people here, so I can
email
send it to you. And we can get it online too, so it will be out there.
I can answer this. What is the time investment of the project as well? I think that, it really depends on the individual. Some people are very much in tune with the big picture of what they're doing, more so than others. I know from experience with biomedical research, I'm in MCG, that students and faculty are so buried in the weeds that it takes longer to really see, to really get a feel for what a lay perspective would be on the research, and it takes a little bit more time. But we've had other people. There was one person, for example, who actually won. This is Mohammed from the Dental College of Georgia. And he was pretty much in tune, and it took almost no time at all for him to get his content together. And so really the answer to that question is it depends in terms of how long it takes, in the project. But I would respond to this question. So how much is the time investment? So with what else are you going to do? I mean, this is your research. This is an opportunity for you to see your own work in a way that's going to help you explain it to everybody. We can say it's not that important. We don't need to. All we need to do is explain it to our mentor and our advisory committees or what have you. But I'm hoping that after what I presented, you realize that that's not the case. It's important to present it to lots of people. But even having said that, if you want to present your research just to your final defense, for example, that's what you're most concerned about. The ability to really understand the pillars of your research, the big picture, well enough to explain it to a lay audience. That's the crystal clear message that you should bring back to when you're doing your dissertation. The only difference is when you're doing a seminar or what have you, writing a manuscript, you're writing it for people that are more forgiving of you giving them a little bit more detail. But the pillars and understanding what those real impacts of your research are, I don't think there's anything more worthy of investing time and effort on. If you don't see that big picture research, then what are you doing in your research? You don't understand what the big picture is. So I would say it doesn't matter how much time it takes. It's a worthy investment of effort. All right, so the next one, Dr. Cameron, you want to take that one? So
do you need to be eligible, or do you need to be ready to submit your thesis? Oops, they're moving here. I think that was a question.
yeah.
So you don't have to be ready to submit your thesis. You have to be at a stage where your conclusions and the broader impact of your research can be addressed. Like Dr. Browning said, it shouldn't be, this is what I plan to do. It shouldn't be, I did one experiment. So you need to have your hypothesis and enough research done that you can put it together in a little story. It doesn't need to be your final thesis or your final defense. Clearly, people who are farther along should be encouraged, and they'll have more information to talk. But it shouldn't be right at the beginning before you've really done any experiments. So you have to find the sweet spot. If you're a biomedical science PhD, we ask that you've passed your comprehensive exam before you're eligible to participate. So, we have students that are master's students that can participate, students that are in a professional doctorate or in a PhD program. So there are different people on different timelines with different amounts of research, but it's if you have enough data and enough research to be able to put it together and tell your story about what you have done, and it should be your original research.
Can I add one thing to that? That was a great response. So based on the presentation that I just gave, your content has these 5 sections to them. One of them is your results. So if you don't have any results, then you're going to be deficient in one of the areas. But if you look at the handout and some of the questions that I have on each one of those different components of the content, one of them is, or the final one is, now that you've got the conclusions to your research, what has to be done now to change the world? So everybody's research is just usually a part of the big picture. And so something has to be done. Like, I might have found a novel, pathway that I can manipulate to prevent colon cancer, but now I've identified a target, and pharmaceutical companies have to come in and develop a new drug, and then we're going to stop people from getting colon cancer. So it's okay to say, here's my hypothesis, here's what I did, and here's some results. Now that we got this cool result, future work needs to do this and that and the other. So that in that regard, you don't have to have your complete story, but you must have some results. Otherwise, you just won't have a competitive presentation.
So Darren, maybe you can take, is it easier or more difficult to present qualitative versus quantitative data in the 3MT format?
I would say that you're not presenting data. You have one slide, and again, I presume that a slide is a different workshop that we can talk about, but we don't present data, we present ideas. The 3-minute thesis, like a TED Talk, I mean, TED Talk goes for a lot longer, but a 3-minute thesis, you have 3 minutes. You're not presenting data, data is something that you experience down in the weeds. You come out with, an outcome of your, you have a method and or experiment, you have an outcome, and you can describe, what they said. So quantitative or qualitative, I think that, you can say, and, we 99% killed all of the COVID virus or whatever, then, that's good, because then it's impactful. But again, that's what you're going for. You're trying to impress your audience. You're trying to engage your audience. If you bring quantitative, if you prioritize quantitative stuff just for the sake of being accurate, again, it's going to take away from the effectiveness of your presentation. It's the ideas and the impact of the findings that is more important. But ultimately, the answer, qualitative or quantitative, that's up to you and your own kind of research and what kind of results you got.
Fred asks, how many rounds are there? There will be a preliminary round towards the end of February, at the end of February, and there'll be the final round. The preliminaries will be the end of February, beginning of March, and then there'll be the final round, the final competition, which will be the end of March or early April.
Okay, this last one. Are there any suggestions for projects that may not have direct clinical relevance, such as more basic science projects? And, of course, but I would say again, I did mention that research is typically not carried out because it's expensive. Research costs money to do these things, including your stipend. And so research doesn't typically get done just because. There's always some kind of benefit. It doesn't have to be clinical. So, somebody that's in education may be finding out a better way to educate our kids or something along those lines that has a clear, important societal impact, but it's not clinical. So, again, I encourage everybody to you go to YouTube, type in 3-minute thesis, and you'll see ones from explaining complicated quantum physics things in a way that you just smiling because, wow, I understand that now, and that's really cool. And so, no, it doesn't have to have a direct clinical relevance. Again, having experienced this for many years now, we've had some people in biomedical sciences PhDs that are so deep into the weeds. I don't remember what this project was now, studying like a microtubule interacting protein in a neuron, and they didn't see the big picture. And then after some discussion, some introspective reflection and whatnot, then it turns out that actually, yeah, they were really trying to identify a way to prevent, neurotoxicity of some common pesticides and what chemicals that are found in the environment. And so again, it was when they first presented, it was a very, very basic, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. I don't see the big picture. But then after some real thought, then it became clear that this is how it affects the audience or the big picture. So the answer is, spend that time before. Don't write anything. Look at the topics in that handout. That's okay. These are the components. And that first one is one of the most important. Try and figure out the main project and what the real significance of that project is to the community at large. And, spend some time doing that. And certainly you can talk to, as I would say, as I mentioned, talk to as many people as you can. You'll be challenged even to do that, to trying to get them to explain your research, but it's a big thing. So I would say that the significance of any research project that anyone's doing can be explained and has a purpose.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. It doesn't have to have clinical relevance. I've been to a bunch of these nationally when I've gone, and it's up to the speaker, the 3MT presenter, to let the audience know what the importance is and what's the relevance of it. I've seen people talk about from economics, somebody won. From a nutrition talk, someone won. Someone talked about the impact of streetlights in parks on wildlife. It can be many different topics, and the presenter it's up to them to make their case as to what the relevance is and why it's important and how they tell that story. So it can have clinical relevance, but it could also have a relevance in many different other areas. So it's up to you to let us know why what you've done is important and what the significance is. But it doesn't have to be clinical relevance. And, we hope and anticipate we'll have some people this year from education and from nursing. And, as our cyber students develop their PhDs, we hope to have people from the cyber PhD program, from allied health. So many different areas here at AU we hope will be contributing and participating, and they won't all be on projects that have clinical relevance.
Do we cover all of them? Nope. Okay, so my dissertation research project is about pure methodology, a method to conduct one kind of hypothesis testing. I feel that it can be hard to be presented as a 3-minute thesis. Well, that's the challenge. To try and, that is what you're challenged to do in the 3-minute thesis. And I would say that we had somebody from biostatistics do a project. Unfortunately, they actually got recruited before they they got recruited, so they never finished their 3MT, unfortunately, because they got a job already. But even retrospectively, they came back and said, actually, working on the 3MT actually helped me get the job, because they were able to really effectively explain their research. But that project was writing code for a new way of analyzing complex data sets. And so, there's so many practical uses of that, and you have to identify the practical uses of the research that you're doing. So I think that his idea was, all of the data that Google is collecting on us, and it knows about everything. And so all this reams of information, how can the information be looked at in a way to get useful information that can help us going forward? And so going from just writing code on a computer to what is the big picture outcomes of that, or how might it affect us? So in terms of your dissertation research, how to, if your research is defining a process in order to develop a hypothesis, it may be hard to come up with a 3MT for it, but it's certainly useful for you to explain, to have the ability to identify ways that this, the longer game might be useful to society as a whole. And again, I would encourage, I think this is absolutely critical of every single graduate student that's doing research, that they should know the importance of why they're doing the research. And I think that so that is the challenge. I think the more challenging it is, and the further you are down in the weeds, then the more benefit you're going to get, and the more exhilarating it'll be when you finally get that thing together. Trust me, it'll happen. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Browning. This has been really helpful. Stay tuned for more information and more opportunities and more details. We'll be in touch, and I wrote down your email or your name, so I will email you that form. And soon we will get this presentation out on the web so you can watch it again if you would like to. So thank you so much. Appreciate you being here, and great job, Darren.
Thank you.